Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look on our further exploration of the Open Sicilian, and we're going to be taking a look at something called the Velimerovic Attack. Now, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So after e4, c5, knight of 3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight of 6, knight c3, we have our basic Open Sicilian setup. Now, what's interesting is the Velimerovic attack can take place after a number of different move orders. We can get there via a Najdorf move order after, say, a6, bishop c4, and then, say, e6, bishop back to b3, if they were to develop here with a move like knight to c6. Bishop e3, bishop e7, this could just transpose into a Velimerovic attack. We would continue with the Velimerovic attack idea of queen e2, castles queenside, rook hg1, g4, g5, etc. It can also come out of a Schwenningen move order. It can come out of e6, bishop c4, bishop e7, bishop e3, and of course there's a lot of obvious possible transpositions here. They could play a6 here and possibly transpose. They could castle, and then after bishop e3, they could plug knight to c6. There's also an independent line that we covered in the last video where black can try the move knight a6, and there's also independent lines where black can try a6 and b5, which is not going to be your Velimerovic at that point. So the Velimerovic is something that we play specifically in this one specific setup. And I guess you could say that it would normally come out of a classical because the Velimerovic attack involves the setup with the knight on c6. But after bishop c4, e6, we would have bishop b3, and then we would do something like, say, bishop e7, bishop e3, and then, say, a6, queen e2 would be the classical kind of Velimerovic. Now, the Velimerovic can be played with or without a6, and of course that does make it a bit different if they don't play a6. So one of the things that you do need to keep track of is whether or not your opponent has played the move pawn to a6. So one of the things that is on the table for white if they don't play the move pawn to a6 is at some point there is this possibility of knight to b5. And I think this is where the people that play the black pieces do get a little bit confused with the theory. Because honestly, in the mainline Velimerovic, if you've played a6, I wouldn't recommend capturing with knight takes d4, and I'll show you the variations in that in a second, because I think you're actually giving white kind of his ideal Velimerovic attack when you make that capture. But there was this one game that a lot of people know about. It was in my 60 Memorable Games. It was Fischer versus Geller. I believe it was 1967. And that game went bishop to d7, and then queen e2, and then Geller castled. We have castles queenside. And now Geller intended to play queen a5, and he didn't want to waste time with playing pawn on a7 to a6. Now this is important, because if he were to just play queen a5 right now, it could be met with knight on d to b5, which is basically just winning the pawn on d6 outright. There's no really good way to defend it. If, for example, knight e8, we would simply continue with bishop f4, and there's nothing better here than just to play a6 and just give up this pawn. And white would have a huge advantage. So if you're going to play a move like queen a5 or even queen c7, at this point you need to prep it with a move like a6, or you need to do what Geller did, which is exchange on d4 and then play queen a5, and not waste that tempo with pawn to a6, since there's no longer a knight that can go to b5. Now, what's interesting is even Fischer's reply to all of this wasn't terribly bad. Fischer did end up losing this game, and of course we're very results-oriented in chess, so this had a huge impact on what we thought about the position. But Fischer missed a really big opportunity in that game. After bishop c6, Fischer played f4, and then after rook ad8, Fischer played rook hf1. And then after b5, we had pawn to f5, which was actually a very good move. And then after b4, Fischer, went all in. I think in his book he said the die is cast or something like that. And he played f captures e6. And then after bc3, what's interesting is Fischer did end up going on to lose this game. Of course, you can see the position is already quite wild. But his next move was an error. He played e captures f7, and, he went on to lose. And of course, in positions like this, where, it's very wild and very crazy, it's good to have this prepped at home, where you have time to just let the computer sit on it. Rook f6 is completely winning for white. After rook f6, the continuation would go, let's say, bishop f6, we would play bishop f6, ef6, e7, forking both rooks would be winning. And then the other option is, of course, gf6. And on gf6, we would have e takes f7, and then we would have king h8, queen g4, rook b8, something like, say, queen e6, queen d8, rook f1, rook d4, bishop c3, rook takes e4, rook takes f6, and this is completely winning for white. You can't actually take the queen. It's kind of cool. You can't take the queen because you are getting mated, so it's kind of an issue. I mean, well, you're giving back all of your material. If, for example, rook takes e6, we would have rook takes, and then, say, bishop f6. We could play, actually, either rook takes or bishop takes, but rook takes is probably more accurate. Rook takes because now you can't even play queen takes because we have bishop takes f6 mate. And on rook takes f7, you're going to have rook takes, check. And then when the king moves, we're moving the rook away with a discovered check because we have another bishop as well. So this is winning. The line that Geller gave was rook e1 check, and then after bishop takes, we would have bishop f6, and then bishop a5 is completely winning for white as well. So there was this option in the game that just would have been really good for Fischer. So for the most part, we shouldn't view this line as terrifying or anything like that. We should be willing to go into this and just keep in mind that rejoinder with rook f6 at the end of everything, and you should be fine. But needless to say, this isn't exactly what we would consider the main line. Really, the main line is inserting the move a6 to prevent the inclusion of knight on d to b5. And then after queen e2, we would have queen c7, and we would have castles queenside, and we would have castles kingside, and thus begins the main line of the Velimerovic with rook hg1. So now, at this point, our intention is, if black doesn't do anything, if he just kind of hangs out, or he plays some sort of passive strategy, or if he plays a strategy similar to the strategy that Geller came up with, which was to exchange on d4 and, play the bishop to c8, d7 to c6, which is what a lot of people do, a lot of tournament players and a lot of club players, they really do think that this is the plan for black in this position. But again, Geller wasn't wasting that tempo with a6, and in an opening where both sides are playing for mate, one tempo is a very, very big deal. Geller actually didn't have enough tempos in his game, in reality. He just happened to make it work because, of course, Fischer's attack was slightly inaccurate. So, after bishop g7, g4, if black takes this approach of shuffling his bishop to the c6 square, he's actually got basically a losing position after g5. This is just kind of the ideal Velimerovic attack. Now there's two possible knight retreats here. There's knight d7 and there's knight to e8. And you're going to respond to each of them a little bit differently. So my general rule is when the knight goes back to d7 and has the potential to go to c5, I don't move this rook up to d3 immediately because sometimes knight c5 is a good move there. So in this case, like 9 times out of 10, the move g6 is kind of the correct approach whenever this knight goes to d7. And that's because this e6 pawn is loose, so it makes it impossible to play f takes g6. So they're going to have to play h takes g6. And then in this case, the easiest way to continue storming the position, if this rook had moved away, I would probably continue with rook takes g6, f g6 and takes, because then the king would be forced to move. But if the rook is still sitting on f8 waiting to go to f7, then we just need to break down the position mechanically. So we would just do something like f4 with the intention of playing f5. And we're just going to break down the position in front of the black king. And there's not much black can do. Like, black's best reply is bishop f6. We should exchange. We should continue with f5. And the position is already nearly impossible to defend for black. So, like, if, for example, rook e8, and these are all computer-best moves, of course, fe6, we would play rook g6, and white would have a huge attack for nothing. He hasn't sacrificed any material. So he has a huge attack. He sacrificed that pawn, but then he got that pawn back. So this is basically a huge attack for zero investment. And, white's just got a huge advantage there. So then the other retreat they can try is they can try knight e8. Now in this case, rook d3 is really reasonable. Now what I'm setting up with rook d3 is I'm setting up the move queen h5. So if, for example, b5, or really if any move, I'm going to play the move queen h5. So the whole point here is that my threat is rook h3 followed by queen h7 mate. And as crude as this threat is, it's incredibly difficult to stop in this position. Actually, it's basically impossible. At this point, the position is resignable. It's already pretty much over. If, for example, g6, you have this cool mate in 3. Pause the video and see if you can find it. It would go queen h7, king h7, rook h3, king g8, and then rook h8 is mate. So that's kind of what's going on. So let's go back and let's say, okay, let's say they don't play bishop c6. Let's say they take a slightly more aggressive plan. Let's say they play b5. So now, of course, we're going to play g5, and now this knight will retreat to the e8 square, because where else is it going to retreat? It can't really retreat anywhere else, because the bishop is covering d7. So here, the best continuation is going to be queen h5 with that same exact plan of rook d3, h3. Here, queen h5 is stronger than rook d3, mostly because after rook d3, black can be annoying and kind of insert g6 ahead of time. If you play queen h5 right away, it's really difficult for black to organize any kind of defense, because if he plays g6 here, we're going to play queen h6, and we just don't have enough time to organize any kind of defense before this rook lift can take place. We can throw in some moves to muddy the waters for a move or two. Like, we can play queen d8 and put some pressure on g5, and then we can simply, make that a brick wall. We can play f4, and then after e5, we can just start ignoring all of what black is doing. Now we can play knight d5 and say, okay, if you want to take here, that's fine. We've got threats of our own. So it's kind of an issue. After here, we would play f5, and now we can just shuffle this rook over to hold the pawn, and then up to f3, and not only are we getting that rook to h3 with mate on h7, but everything in the middle of the board is under control. Basically, all of black's pieces are spectators. They're not doing anything in this position. They're completely blocked in. And, of course, this is the nightmare scenario in a Velimerovic attack for black. And that's why black really can't afford to play these super slow, super passive setups. It's actually really important that as soon as the Velimerovic attack kind of gets started, that black starts beginning his sortie with b5 and b4, etc. So this is actually, just right here, this is a very critical moment, is we need to play the move pawn to b5, and we need to immediately start putting some sort of pressure on white's position with the move b5. So here, of course, after b5, white should respond with the immediate pawn to g4, continuing with his plan. And now it's kind of an interesting question of, should black play pawn to b4, or shouldn't black play pawn to b4? So this gets kind of interesting. So if black plays pawn to b4 immediately, there are two sacrifices here that look very good for white, and then there's a third possibility that doesn't look as good for white, but it might be okay. So the two moves that really white can try are just basically throwing in knight d5 right away. And at first, this move seems a little strange, but basically the idea is that if we take this knight, we're going to take on c6, and then queen takes c6, we're going to play g5, and then when we play bishop to d5, we're going to be getting all of our material back. So now the second possibility is we can preempt this. We can play knight c6 right away. So we can play knight captures c6, and then after queen takes c6, we can play knight to d5. And this is basically the same approach. If e takes d5, we're going to play g5, and we're going to play bishop takes d5. So the issue comes in, I guess, if they kind of leave it, like if they don't take anything, or more to the point, if they just don't win any material, like if they choose to take it with, say, the knight, for example. So like knight d5, and then you could have e d5, knight d4, and then rook d4. Now this has actually been played before, This was actually a topical game between Lebovic and Korchnoi in Tilburg in 1985 that ended in a draw, and that game continued with a5, rook c4, queen back, d6, bishop e6, rook c6, and white ended up being okay, but like I said, Korchnoi was able to get a draw without too much difficulty with the black pieces, so needless to say, white's attack has kind of petered out at this point. So the other possibility is that we can play the preemptive move first. We can play this knight c6, queen c6, knight d5. And then again, the issue is what happens if they just play something like knight d5. Well, we're going to continue with e takes d5. Queen retreats, we're going to take, and then we're going to play something like g5. Now, in these situations, it seems like white has a little bit more to work with since he's got some weaknesses in black's camp. But it still wasn't quite enough to win in Naumann versus Lanka in Germany in 2002. That game also ended in a draw, even though white had a little bit more to play with than he did in the other line. So there's a third attempt here that can be tried, is after b4 we could follow up with the immediate g5. Now this is kind of interesting because there's several lines here that lead to a completely forced draw. And then there's a couple little pitfalls, of course, where black could go wrong. So after bc3 and then g takes f6, we've got the open g file, and we've got quite a bit of play. After bishop f6, we can play queen f3, cb2 check, king b1. Black almost always throws in this check. I don't know why. If it were me, I'd just save it. I wouldn't throw it in, but it doesn't really make any difference in the position either way. So there's a couple of possibilities here, and they're all pretty unclear. Black could, of course, get this bishop out of the line of fire, because right now queen to f6 is a threat. I've actually had several games on the internet end with knight takes d4, queen f6, and knight e5, queen f6, just ending the game. But that's why you need to move this bishop is one possibility. You could play bishop e5, and then h4 is supposed to be just incredibly unclear. White has lots of compensation for the material in the form of open files towards the enemy king. And the computer just gives a level assessment, so I'm not exactly sure what it means. There's no clear perpetual. It just thinks white has compensation. So the other possibility is that we play king h8 and we sidestep the pin. So here, white can't get too aggressive. Like, it almost seems like white would want to play something like bishop h6, which looks really cool. If, for example, knight takes d4, you have queen f6, gf6, bishop g7, followed by bishop f6 mate. Unfortunately, knight e5 leaves you in the dust, because you can't play queen f6, because now this knight is actually covering g6, and you just kind of embarrassingly sacked your queen for no reason, and now there's no mate. So the recommended move here, there's two moves that are possible, but they both seem to end in forced draws from what I can tell. And I'm not sure if there's like maybe another path, but there's knight c6, queen c6, and then you can just sack your queen for the draw. You can play queen f6, gf6, bishop h6, and there's no preventing the eventual perpetual. You can trade off some pieces, and then we just repeat. We're going to play bishop g7, bishop h6, bishop g7, bishop h6. There's just no way around this. The other possibility is you could try something like e5, and this is really interesting because there's not a lot of moves against e5. It's a really scary move. You're threatening to take this bishop, you're threatening to take this knight, you're putting pressure against the king, and you really do have to find, at least putting your opponent on the spot, you really have to find the correct move right here. The only move is seemingly knight takes d4, and then after rook d4, d takes e5, it doesn't appear like there's anything better at this point than to once again just force the draw with queen takes f6. But I mean, maybe this just needs some more exploration. We don't necessarily have to give up on it right here. For example, you could try rook to c4, but then again after queen b7, since there's pressure on the queen now, it doesn't seem like you have anything better than to just go ahead and play queen f6 anyway, and we're right back to this forced perpetual check. But it feels like there should be something here, but it looks like white's just getting a perpetual in all of these lines. But it's still not a bad line necessarily to play for your average tournament player or club player. You've got that draw in the bag, you've got that perpetual if you need it, and they've got to find some pretty accurate moves in order to get there, in order to force that draw. But from a preparation standpoint, if I was in a tournament and I absolutely had to play for a win, I probably wouldn't play g5. I would probably go with knight takes c6, queen c6, knight d5, as that appears to give the best winning chances for white after b4, and those positions seem to be clearly slight edge white. So the main line here is knight to d7, and then we start into the wild complications of knight to f5. And I'd like to go over more of this, but this video is now already 20 minutes long. So this, starting from here, with these complications, is going to constitute its own video with all these wild complications starting from here. So, anyways, thanks for watching this video of part 1 of the Velimerovic Attack, and I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you learned something new about chess and learned something that you can use in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.